The recording studio in New York fell silent. It was March 2020, and music industry executives from across Europe had gathered at Universal Records Studios for an international talent showcase. When the Philippine delegation introduced their performer, Quincy Jones, America's most successful music producer with 20 Grammy nominations and 3 wins, let out a dismissive laugh that echoed through the control room. A Filipino street singer, Quincy Jones said in his crisp American accent, looking at the young woman standing nervously by the microphone, "You want me to listen to someone who performs on sidewalks for coins?" He leaned back in his leather chair, arms crossed. The Filipino voice won't work in international music. Too raw, too unpolished. Your singers have passion. I'll give you that. But passion without proper training is just noise. The room packed with ANA representatives, talent scouts, and international media erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Quincy Jones continued, warning to his critique, "I've spent 30 years in this industry. I've worked with Adele, Ed Sheeran, Sam Smith, artists with world-class technique. What do Filipino street singers have? Karaoke skills and YouTube covers. That's not artistry, that's imitation." He gestured dismissively toward the young woman. "Your voice might work in Manila shopping malls, but international audiences demand sophistication, control, technical excellence. Street singing doesn't translate to professional recording." Several American executives in the room nodded in agreement. Quincy Jones pointed at the microphone setup. "This is Universal Music Road Studios, where the Beatles recorded, where legends are made. You think someone who learned to sing on street corners belongs here? I've turned away conservatory graduates with better credentials than whatever you're about to show." Me, Sofia Cruz, stood quietly by the microphone, her face calm despite the humiliation. At 24 years old, she had spent 7 years performing on the streets of Manila, saving every peso to afford this showcase opportunity. Her teacher, Lola Carmen, a 70-year-old former opera singer, had trained her in traditional Filipino vocal techniques blended with classical training. Sofia had heard this dismissal before from local producers who told her to sound more Western, from talent shows that rejected her for being too ethnic, from audiences who walked past her on the streets because she did sing the popular covers they expected. What Quincy Jones didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. "Mr. Sterling," Sofia said calmly in clear English, "would you be willing to make this showcase more meaningful? Give me 3 minutes, one song. If my street singer voice doesn't belong here, I'll leave quietly. But if it does, perhaps you'll reconsider what professional really means." Quincy Jones' expression shifted from amusement to irritation. 3 minutes, fine, one song, but understand, I've heard thousands of singers. My ears don't lie. If you're not Abbey Road quality, everyone in this room will know within 30 seconds. He gestured to the sound engineer. "Set her up. Let's get this over with. We have actual talent to hear today." The engineer positioned Sofia at the vintage Neumann microphone, the same one used by countless legends. Several executives checked their watches. One was already texting. The studio fell silent as Sofia closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. She chose Anak, a Filipino classic known to every Filipino, but unfamiliar to most international audiences. But she didn't sing it the way it was traditionally performed. She opened with a technique called kundiman, a Filipino vocal style that uses subtle emotional ornamentation, allowing the voice to breathe and bend in ways that Western training often discourages. Her voice started soft, almost vulnerable, then built with a control that made every person in the room lean forward. Quincy Jones Sterling's arms slowly uncrossed. What he was hearing wasn't raw street singing. It was technically flawless, but emotionally devastating. A combination he rarely encountered even from artists with decades of training. Sofia's voice had the power of gospel, the control of classical opera, and the soul of someone who had lived every word she sang. She bent notes in ways that Western singers couldn't, using techniques passed down through generations of Filipino vocalists: subtle vibrato, controlled breathiness, emotional ornamentation that came from harana and kundiman traditions. At the 1-minute mark, something remarkable happened. The other executives in the room stopped checking their phones. The sound engineer leaned forward, adjusting levels he didn't need to adjust just to have something to do with his hands. Quincy Jones' skeptical expression had transformed into something else: confusion mixed with awe and the uncomfortable realization that he might have been completely wrong. Sofia's voice carried a quality that couldn't be taught in conservatories. It was the sound of someone who had sung through rain on Manila streets, who had performed for audiences that could walk away at any moment, who had learned that technique without emotion is just exercise, but emotion with technique is transcendence. Every note was perfect, but more than that, every note meant something. At the 90-second mark, something happened that Quincy Jones had only witnessed 3 times in his 30-year career. The hair on his arm stood up, his eyes watered. The emotional impact of what he was hearing bypassed his critical mind and went straight to something deeper, the place where music stops being sound and becomes feeling. At the 2-minute mark, Sofia shifted into English, improvising lyrics that spoke about being dismissed, being told you don't belong, being called not good enough. Her voice soared to a high note that she held for 12 seconds, perfectly controlled. Emotionally devastating, technically impossible for most trained singers. The note didn't waver, it didn't strain, it simply existed in the air like something that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. The room was completely silent except for her voice. When she finished, there was no sound. Quincy Jones sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. The other executives looked stunned. One woman had tears streaming down her face. The sound engineer had stopped taking notes and was simply staring. The executive who had been texting had his phone in his lap, forgotten. 5 seconds of silence, 10 seconds, 15. Then the room erupted in applause. Not the polite golf clap of industry professionals, but genuine thunderous applause. Several people stood up. Someone shouted, "Brilliant." Quincy Jones stood up slowly, walked into the recording booth, and did something he had never done in 30 years of producing. He approached Sofia and his voice cracked as he said, "I need to apologize. That wasn't street singing. That was one of the most technically skilled and emotionally powerful performances I've ever heard in this studio. And I've recorded legends." He paused, struggling with the words. "I was arrogant. I was wrong. And I almost missed witnessing something extraordinary because I judged where you came from instead of listening to what you brought." She's teaching us hers. Major music schools from Berkeley to Juilliard began incorporating Filipino vocal techniques into their curricula. What had been dismissed as street singing was recognized as a sophisticated vocal tradition with technical elements that enhanced emotional expression in ways Western classical training often suppressed. Vocal coaches who had spent careers teaching European bel canto technique traveled to the Philippines to study with masters like Lola Carmen. The video of Sofia's Abbey Road performance went viral, accumulating over 200 million views in the first month. But the moment that captured hearts worldwide was what happened immediately after she finished singing. The security camera footage showed Quincy Jones, the man who had mocked her minutes before, standing in the booth with tears in his eyes, saying, "I'm sorry," over and over. Sofia became a global phenomenon, performing at the Grammys, where she won Best New Artist, headlining Coachella and Glastonbury, and collaborating with artists who had once seemed unreachable. But she never forgot her roots. Every few months she returned to the same Manila streets where she had started performing free concerts for the people who had supported her when she was unknown. She established the Sofia Cruz Foundation, which provided free vocal training to street performers across the Philippines. teaching proper technique while preserving traditional Filipino musical styles. Quincy Jones never forgot his lesson. 5 years later, when asked about that day at Abbey Road, he said in a widely shared interview, "I had spent my career believing that proper training meant Western classical technique, that sophistication meant conservatory education, that real talent only emerged from established institutions. Sofia showed me that some of the world's most sophisticated vocal traditions developed outside concert halls. They developed in streets, in communities passed down through generations, refined by singers who had nothing but their voices and their stories." He continued, "That day I learned the difference between technical ability and artistry. Technical ability is what you can measure and teach in a classroom. Artistry is what happens when technique serves emotions so completely that you forget the technique exists." Sofia had both in equal measure. But because she learned on streets instead of studios, I almost missed it entirely. I almost let my prejudice rob me of working with one of the most talented artists I've ever encountered. Today, Universal Record Studios has a small plaque in Studio to Place there by Quincy Jones himself. It reads, "Music has no address. Genius doesn't require permission. Listen before you judge." Below it is the date of Sofia's performance, March 15, 2020, and a single line. "The day a street singer taught us what professional really means." Lola Carmen, Sofia's elderly teacher, said it best in an interview after the breakthrough, "We never needed Western validation to know our music was beautiful. But sometimes the world needs to hear before it believes." Sofia didn't win because Filipino singing is better than Western technique. She won because she showed that true artistry has no borders, no prerequisites, no requirements except the courage to share your voice, even when others say it doesn't belong. The streets of Manila taught her something conservatories cannot, that music without heart is just noise. No matter how perfect the technique, Sofia didn't win because she had better training than conservatory singers. She won because she understood that music isn't about following rules or meeting industry standards. It's about connecting emotion to sound in ways that touch the human heart. Quincy Jones learned that talent doesn't come with an address, that genius doesn't wait for permission from gatekeepers, and that sometimes the most extraordinary voices belong to those the world tried to silence. The street singer they dismissed proved that where you learn matters far less than what you learn, and that the greatest artistry often comes from those who had to fight the hardest just to be heard.